Joseph is faced with the first worldwide crisis where you've suddenly got a famine in the whole world. And his solution was ingenious.
It becomes even more difficult because I would argue that this change at the time between a trustee to an administrator would have been seemingly mundane, potentially so mundane that most people would not have known the catastrophic difference between these two propositions.
Various versions of this narrative have characterised the way societies have run, which have resulted in huge inequity, unrest, and what the Bible is trying to do is to demonstrate through a very powerful narrative followed by a sophisticated legal system that we can do it differently.
The Manna Journey is the catalyst for change in our world. It's a consistent source of truth for the next generation and current leaders. Our mission is to change the world by reframing our current governance, by using ancient wisdom to solve modern problems, and by shaping innovative new businesses to have a culture of pursuit of purpose.
Is the law working for modern society, and is the Bible the place to look for how we can redesign our legal system? Well, Philip Ullman thinks we can learn from the Bible, and this is part of the Manna Journey, a series that looks at how we can bring more Bible study and more understanding into our modern everyday life. I'm joined, of course, by Philip Ullman, but also by Harvey Bolofsky, who is the Emeritus Rabbi of the Golders Green Synagogue. Harvey, welcome.
Harvey and I have actually looked in detail at many sections of the Bible, but the whole in-depth review started, I think, with the Joseph stories. Just want to recap where we got to together over the course of time, where we looked carefully at the dreams that Pharaoh. So Pharaoh has dreams that there's going to be 7 years of famine followed by 7 years of plenty. And probably the other way around, 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. When we looked carefully at this, we noticed that, in fact, the problem is more complicated than we realised. In fact, it was the word haaretz, which means the world, might mean the world. That's not the way it's been translated traditionally, but it's the way it's used in the very first sentence of the Bible. We noticed that Joseph was actually coming up with an ingenious solution to what was a world crisis. So the way it seems is that there was 7 years of plenty in Egypt, but in the rest of the world there were 7 years of normal satisfaction. And then the 7 years of famine that followed were lesser in Egypt than they were in the rest of the world. And so Joseph is faced with the first worldwide crisis where you've suddenly got a famine in the whole world. And his solution was ingenious. His solution, as the way we read it, it's not been read in this way before, except that, but it's the way we see it, and it's an authentic reading, is that he suggests that the trustees should be appointed in each city to collect in that city during the years of plenty in Egypt.
And what's the difference between a trustee and an administrator?
Harvey, can we take that?
So a trustee is a type of administrator. The specific role of a trustee is, I would prefer to use the translation custodian, because a custodian, first of all, makes it very clear that you are looking after something on behalf of someone else. Your role is to care for it, possibly improve it, guard it, and at the right time return it, possibly in an improved condition, to the original owner. And the word that is used, particularly in this text, in the book of Genesis, indicates that what Joseph had in mind was that local custodians would be appointed. They had the technology and the resources to make sure the grain was guarded, to make sure it didn't rot, to make sure that it was properly looked after, so that when they needed it, and also to make sure that people didn't end up eating it in error, or perhaps imagining there wouldn't really be a famine after all, so that at the right time they would open the storehouses, and these custodians, a type of administrator but a more sophisticated administrator, would then give back the grain to those people to enable them to survive the famine. And although that isn't what happened, this introduces the idea of the custodian, which is so critical to our understanding of the relationship between people, how to form the glue of societies, how they treat their resources, particularly resources which are excess to their own needs, and the divine.
What's important in the trusteeship is that you have control. You are the owner, but your responsibilities in the case of the trust that Joseph was talking about is to the world, which is unique. You're looking at yourself as somebody who is an owner, and the Bible is for ownership. There's no concept of state ownership or communal ownership. The Bible is clear that you are in control, but you have to look at the wider needs of society. So obviously, you start with your family. We always look at it in concentric circles. You start with the family, community, nation, and then other nations. So there's definitely concentric circles. But Joseph says this right from the beginning. He says, no, there's a global crisis. The only solution is in Egypt because nowhere else was there a solution to the problem. And he said, look, local trustees, which starts to create local responsibility, but they have to consider the worldwide needs. And therefore, presumably, the idea was that the excess in each area, you then assess where the needs are. You have a central system where I presume each city around the world is saying, I'm short of this. And then you need a central system to actually ensure that it's distributed to where your needs are. But it's clear this doesn't need a market. It doesn't need a price. When you're doing that kind of distribution, you've got a scarce resource, which is food. It didn't happen because of the Pharaoh. What the Pharaoh actually says, he's Machiavellian, he's a power player, and he says, no, the word he uses, rak hakise egdal mimeka. I am concerned, as most kings are and would have been at the time, with himself, with his own ego. So he says to Pharaoh, he says to Joseph, you're obviously very bright, but you've got to do it my way, which is you've got to line my pockets. The trustees disappear. The concept of the trust isn't there. And the instruction to Joseph is that you dictate, you actually have to control what's going on and run things in such a way that coffers get filled up. And that's what...
This presages what happens in societies where there's a scarcity of resources, where a small number of people who have power, control, or trust are able to effectively amass resources because people are vulnerable, people are frightened, and it enables those to say, well, okay, well, if you want grain, then you're going to have to buy it from us. And once you've bought it and you've run out of resources, well, then what's going to happen next? You'll have to give us your land and your animals, and eventually they effectively become slaves. And this, it's a fairly crude typology, but we can see various ways in which this is played out at different times of society. And you can see that this is the beginning of considering, where there is scarcity of resources, how do we ensure that the small number of people do not exploit that scarcity to become richer at the expense of everyone else, which is really the beginning of a conversation about how to run a modern economy in a fair way.
But Harvey, it becomes even more difficult because I would argue I would say to both of you that this change at the time between a trustee to an administrator would have been seemingly mundane, potentially so mundane that most people would not have known the catastrophic difference between these two propositions. Because either way, there's somebody that runs the grain store. The exact terms and conditions of that won't have been examined, will they? Particularly,
well, they seem to have accepted it. In fact, they say in the end, we want to be slaves. So clearly, the mindset was accepted by the people. Joseph came from a different background, and he obviously thought about others. He was naturally somebody that cared for family and community, and he came with the ideal, beautiful solution, but it didn't. Sorry, the king was clever enough to think, wow, this is bright. I'm going to start hoarding this stuff, but for myself, and that's the big lesson and the concept we need to discuss is how should we be governing our companies? How should we be governing our organisations? Because we have a fundamental misalignment between the state and the market. If you allow people in companies to act solely in their own interest, you get the kind of thing that happened in Egypt.
This is where the law becomes so important, because what we are talking about here is needing to appoint somebody, as I said, somebody who needs to run the grain store. But what is the law that governs them? Is it one that's for the people, or is it one that's for the elite? And that difference, which many people might not have even noticed at the time, it becomes the difference between whether you eventually become a slave or you eventually become a free person.
And in fact, this same narrative recurs in the story literally just a couple of chapters, Exodus chapter 18, before the Ten Commandments are given on Sinai, where there's an interesting debate between Jethro and Moses as to how the law should work. Yes. And Moses, if you look carefully at the wording, says, I want to resolve disputes by teaching the law, teaching people intimately how to resolve the disputes between the people themselves.
It's a democratization of a legal system. It's in principle to allow people to have the tools to sort out their own problems in a kind of collaborative. So it's in a collaborative, or if you're in a kind of more mediated approach. Jethro's approach is to report a very, very complex hierarchy of judges and overseers. And effectively what happens is that the person at the bottom, there'll be a minor dispute. And if the minor judge can't deal with it, it'll be escalated. And it creates a whole kind of expansion of conflict. And while it is not perhaps the most mainstream reading, because the normal reading, certainly the one I remember from when I was a kid, is that Moses is worn out, he can't cope, and Jethro is brought in to solve the problem. If you look very carefully in the Deuteronomy recap of the events, it looks as though, with hindsight, this was not regarded as a success, this alternative.
And what you see is, in fact, Jethro says, you, Moses, should tell people where to go and what to do from the top, which is the way dictatorships work. And then which is what Joseph is forced to do by Pharaoh. It's the same thing. In fact, traditionally, we're told that Jethro was allegedly an advisor. The Midrash says that was an advisor to Pharaoh. And I think that the way the Midrash works that out is because their methodology is the same. It's a repeated history.
Isn't it then true that the Moses idea, which is if everybody understands where they stand, if everybody understands the morality, if everybody understands the rules, then it's going to be really easy to deal with disputes. That's one approach. And then there's the Jethro approach, which is very prescriptive, which is courts this and overseer that and magistrate whatever. That becomes, but I just feel like we are much more similar to the Jethro scenario than we are the Moses scenario, and we're meant to be a developed society.
And if we look at a very high level at the whole Egypt narrative, so Pharaoh says, no, I'm a typical capitalist. I want to line my own pockets. I don't care about anyone else. You end up with, as Harvey says, with the Egyptians becoming sharecroppers. They lose their money, they lose their animals, they lose their land, and then they become slaves. They're sharecroppers. And the Israelites are given their own land and are given food according to the number of children. So they thrive. The immigrants are thriving, and the native population have been effectively decimated, which is not altogether different to an extent what's happening in our society, where, in my own experience, migrant workers are given a lot of the jobs in warehouses, in care homes and things like that. And in many cases, they're not living happy lives. They're actually away from their family. They're not being loved, and they're sending the money home, and they're living, in many cases, from our own experience, sharing beds, sleeping in one bed in the day, and someone else sharing the bed at night, and living off a packet of biscuits. So you end up with a native population potentially disenfranchised and effectively losing out because of the power player. And then the king decides to look after his own, the people that had come up with the ideas, but the migrants then thrive. And that's going to result in social unrest. You're escalating the problem rather than de-escalating, which is what Joseph would have done. He would say, no, make peace, just distribute the grain. There's no friction there. It's all locally distributed.
But Philip, doesn't it also rob people of their own, not so much free will, but their own ability to think? Yeah. Because suddenly it's just every agency is a better word.
It's a loss of agency. I think you saw what happens is not only do we go through this process where instead of their own grain being redistributed, The grain is now treated as a property of Pharaoh. Once it's used up, he exploits them, commodifies them, to use a modern term, and eventually is able to treat everything as an opportunity for to expand power and wealth. Not only that, you end up with a kind of psychological slavery, because often they go, "Yeah, take it, it's fine." They buy into it, and they become, as it were, institutionalized by a certain way of thinking that they can't do any better for themselves, and their best life would be effectively being a robot controlled by Pharaoh. Whereas the Joseph model would have given back their own grain and empowered them to do their own thing.
They didn't know that they didn't seem to understand the level to which they were being exploited.
It's crazy. Their own grain has been taken away from them and sold back to them at an inflated price. But they were happy with it, which means almost the mindset that you're in.
There are echoes of this in the contemporary political and economic narrative, and it's something which is one of the reasons these stories that we said at the beginning are so universal, is because various versions of this narrative have characterised the way societies have run, which have resulted in huge inequity, unrest. And what the Bible is trying to do is to demonstrate through a very powerful narrative, followed by a sophisticated legal system, that we can do it differently.
And it's simple. And what then happens in the next generation, of course, is you've got the native population have been enslaved, have been disenfranchised. You've got the migrants that have been looked after. And you king says, 1 minute, why are all the natives enslaved? And the migrant now large in number and they're growing. So he says, okay, I've got to sort this problem out, because there's a danger to us, because of course the migrants are more powerful. Yes. So what he says is, first thing he does is he taxes them. He says they're a danger. They're a threat to us if he takes away their money, and then, which is analogous to what happened initially, where Pharaoh, number one, took away the money of the Egyptians, and then he actually commits genocide. He said, 1 minute, we've got to start killing the boys. The babies are thrown into the water, into the Nile. So you can see this is escalating because of the beautiful solution that Joseph came up with at the beginning wasn't taken into account. A very small dispute which didn't need any market. There was a shortage in the world. It could have been resolved without a market, without a price, without fight.
The whole legal process is embedding hatred within the system.
It's escalating. I mean, it's effectively creating. We need to think about how Pharaoh would have acted. Pharaoh says to Joseph, "You are going to look after my coffers." Because Joseph is selling grain to the world. He's not going to be able to do every deal. So he's obviously going to create some kind of bureaucratic system. But the command from the top is, get whatever you can from people. Because every deal, presumably everybody comes along has got either money or animals or something. It's going to be some form of exchange. And his instruction must be, just do whatever you can to line the pockets of Pharaoh. And it becomes bureaucratic.
Even at the expense of, I think, of the whole idea of the original proposal is to create a custodianship which is local, because there's a sense that you look after the local economy, and when those resources, there are still excess, then you'd go to the next layer out. And if you look closely at the text, it does seem to be suggesting that ultimately they would be able to export, but the idea would not be to export for sale. It will be, if you're a custodian, you understand the excess isn't yours, and therefore you would give it away. It's not intended. There's no market. There's no market.
And that's the world that we live in is becoming, because of globalization, because of the fact, which is, of course, the market in Joseph's time was a global market as well. So it's almost a full circle. We're now back to, there wasn't technology to globalize. It was the fact that the Bible's dealing with the areas between Mesopotamia and Egypt. So the whole world has a crisis now. We're in a similar position now where the assets are being hived up to the powers because of the technology, and you've got huge organisations with people with billions, hundreds of billions of pounds which they don't need, and the poor workers are in our time suffering from cost of living hikes, inflation of consumer goods, inflation of house. Many people can't buy houses, and people are suffering because the law is complicated, and we allow people to do whatever they want to.